Section 1 of Imperialism and World Politics, Part 4 of 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Alistair. Imperialism and World Politics, Part 4 of 4, by Parker Thomas Moon. Chapter 17. Nationalism versus Imperialism in Europe. Subsection: The Survival of the Weak. Were imperialism sheer ruthless greed, nothing more, nothing less, the smaller and weaker nations of Europe, like those of Africa and Asia, would doubtless have been swallowed up by the insatiable great powers. That many of these impotent small nations have been permitted to remain independent is a fact of the utmost significance for any analysis of the psychology of imperialism. And that there has been a marked tendency of late toward imperialist domination of certain areas of Europe is not less significant. These two facts require explanation. There are really a surprising number of small nations in Europe, utterly incapable of defending themselves against any serious aggression on the part of a great power. In 1914 there were 21 such states, too small or too weak to resist a great power. Footnote: Albania, Andorra, Belgium, Bulgaria, Denmark, Greece, Holy See, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Monaco, Montenegro, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Romania, San Marino, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Serbia, Turkey in Europe. Since the Great War, Montenegro and Serbia have been merged with Yugoslav lands taken from Austria-Hungary to form the Serb, Croat and Slovene state, and the following have been added to the list of smaller states: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, the Free City of Danzig, internationalised Saar Basin, quasi-independent Iceland, and the new Irish Free State might possibly be included, but are not, because the first two are under the control of the League, and second pair are under at least the suzerainty of Denmark and Great Britain, respectively. End of footnote. Only a few of these, namely Andorra, San Marino, the Holy See, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, and Monaco, could be described as falling under the shadow of any great power. The other 15 were independent. And some were tempting morsels. Belgium's rich coal resources could not be defended by a Belgian army which in peace boasted only 50,000 men, and in war a potential 350,000, a tenth of the force France or Germany could exert. Sweden's treasure of high-grade iron ore, needful to the German steel industry, could not be protected by the 200,000 or so men Sweden might put into the field in case of war. Nor was Spain's army of 152,000, with an estimated war strength of 200,000, any adequate guarantee of a country rich in iron, coal, zinc, lead, and other materials. Nor could 300,000 soldiers repel any powerful invader from the valuable forests, the oil fields, or the fertile grainlands of Romania. Such smaller nations, the German Emperor William II is reported to have said, cannot permanently remain independent units in this age of competition among gigantic economic units. Inevitably, the small must gravitate into the orbits of the great. He was not alone in this conception. Pan-German fanatics dared to hope that ultimately the Teutonic Low Countries and Scandinavia, and the partially Germanized Baltic provinces and other lands, would be attached in some way as satellites or dependencies to Teutonic Central Europe embracing Austria as well as Germany. Friedrich Neumann's Mitteleuropa was but one of the more popular of the expositions of this general belief. The theme is in a general way analogous to that of the imperialism described in the earlier chapters of this book, the idea that great industrial nations must expand. If the German expression of the idea has been chosen for illustration, it is not because the Germans were unique in expressing it. Why was the idea not carried out? Why were the imperialist tendencies of the great powers restrained as regards the small countries of Europe? Why have small nations been allowed to continue in existence and to increase in number? Two reasons appear quite clearly. First, the smaller European states were, almost without exception, so highly civilized and well-governed that imperialists could not easily have awakened in any great power either the glowing indignation against atrocities or the humanitarian zeal for the white man's burden and the civilizing mission that are usually required for popular support of aggressive imperialism. For conquering Central Africa, one could plead as justification the necessity of abolishing the slave trade, but what excuse could be offered for the conquest of Sweden? No concession or protectorate or sphere of interest was required to enable Germany to obtain iron ore from Swedish mines, or English capitalists to develop Spanish mineral resources, because in civilized countries the ordinary processes of investment, industry, and commerce suffice for such purposes. As a matter of fact, Germany did obtain iron from Sweden and oil from Romania, and British capitalists did invest in Spain, as well as in most other countries on the continent, and French capitalists bought the bonds of European governments by legitimate and peaceful business transactions. The major economic factors in imperialism, making secure loans granted to an irresponsible government, exploiting hitherto undeveloped resources, opening up a market, were usually lacking. Almost without exception, the European states were too well governed to offer the opening for imperialism. But not quite without exception. European Turkey comes to mind at once. And the European possessions of Turkey would doubtless have been taken by great powers had it not been for Balkan nationalism. As it was, Austria-Hungary took Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Russia took Bessarabia. Another exception was Serbia, whose unstable government and unsavoury record of assassinations had given the Austrian public opinion some ground for the feeling that violence might justifiably be employed to punish Serbian misdeeds. Unruly Portugal likewise offered opportunities for foreign intervention, but was sheltered by alliance with England. The last remark suggests a second reason. Even where some European state was turbulent enough to invite intervention, the intense rivalry of the great powers usually precluded such intervention. For example, an Austro-Hungarian attack on Serbia would be, and was in 1914, opposed by Russia. A German foray into Belgium would be resisted by France and England. Rival imperialisms have occasionally neutralized each other, at least for a time, in Asia and Africa. For example, before 1907, neither Russia nor England dared appropriate Persia. Or again, Korea's independence was long preserved by Russo-Japanese rivalry. But in Europe, this consideration was of much greater weight. In Europe, the acquisition even of a small territory by a great power might be of immense strategic moment, might tilt the trembling balance of power. Strategy endowed small countries like Belgium, Switzerland, and Holland with such value that no great power could be permitted by the others to undertake conquest. Consequently, Europe was only to a very restricted extent a field for imperialism. Possibly the German annexation of Alsace-Lorraine in 1871 might be called imperialistic, but it was an incident of German national unification, and the German desire for its possession was certainly based less on any consideration of its economic value than on contentions that it was historically, ethnically, geographically, or strategically an integral part of the German nation. The Austro-Hungarian occupation of Bosnia-Herzegovina and Novi Basar in 1878, and annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908, may be set down to imperialism, or something closely resembling the imperialism we have seen at work in Africa and Asia. There was in these actions some of the feeling of cultural superiority, some of the economic interest, much of the prestige-seeking, that are typical elements of contemporary imperialism. Austro-Hungarian and German interests, moreover, acquired control of the Orient Railway through the Balkans and sought the right to construct other railways in the Balkans, and mingled economic business with political strategy in somewhat the same way that the reader has learned to recognise in China or Asiatic Turkey. Anyone eager to push the analogy may easily regard the rival aspirations and conflicting intrigues of Austria and Russia, the attempts of each to obtain political influence over the Balkan nations, as part of the story of imperialism. It is so well known that it need not be considered further here. Subsection: Economic and Military Imperialism in Europe since 1914. The Great War of 1914 let loose latent imperialist passions. In Russia, the hope of mastering the Balkans and Constantinople at last seemed realizable, as well as the designs of adding German and Austrian to Russian Poland. In France, ardent chauvinists dreamed of bringing Belgium and Luxembourg into the French orbit commercially, and of establishing the French domination, if not actual sovereignty, over the Saar Basin and the German Rhineland. That the French government in some degree shared such designs is clear from the secret notes it exchanged in February and March 1917 with the Russian government, promising Russia a free hand in drawing the western frontier of Russia in return for permission to annex the Saar Basin in addition to Alsace-Lorraine, and to convert the left bank of the Rhine into an autonomous state occupied by French troops. Italy obtained from the Allies in 1915 a secret pledge to gratify the Italian desire for not only Italia Irredenta, which might be sanctioned by the principle of nationalism, but also part of Dalmatia and the Dalmatian Islands and Albania, possession of which would make the Adriatic in truth an Italian lake and afford a foothold for Italian imperialism in the Balkan Peninsula. Professor Salvemini has alleged that this program was originated by Italian shipping interests. In Germany, on the other hand, a small but vociferous and influential minority clamoured during the war for a thoroughly imperialistic peace. They demanded the iron area of French Lorraine, control of Belgium in one form or another, creation of a row of satellite states on the eastern border of Germany, or possibly actual annexation of Poland, Lithuania, and the Baltic provinces. Ludendorff, the masterful quartermaster general, who well-nigh dominated German policy in the last years of the war, seems to have lent his powerful support to such aims. German imperialist aims were balked by the fortunes of war, Russian imperialism was subverted by the Bolshevik Revolution, and Wilsonian idealism offered an obstacle at the peace conference to the aims of France and Italy. Yet the latter were realised in a measure. The peace conference planned that Italy should annex part of Albania and assume a mandate over the remainder, but revolts in Albania and a reaction against jingoism at home brought about Italy's withdrawal from Albania, and Albania became a free republic, a member of the League of Nations. France was more successful, but not wholly successful. By Article 40 of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany renounced
all right to the exploitation of the railways
of Luxembourg, and recognised that henceforth that Grand Duchy was no longer part of the German Zollverein. In other words, German economic control of this valuable iron-producing state was cancelled, and the door was left open for French control. French plans for the left bank of the Rhine were modified. This populous segment of the demilitarised German nation was occupied by Allied troops, severed from the rest of Germany by a separate tariff regime. The coal mines of the Saar Basin were ceded to France, but instead of permitting France to annex the region outright, Wilson and Lloyd George succeeded in making it an internationalised territory under the political control of an international governing board, appointed by the Council of the League of Nations, and in providing for a plebiscite in 1935. As regards both the Saar and the Rhineland, therefore, French imperialism was only partly gratified and was partly checked by internationalism. The same tendency, it may be remarked, to impose international restraints on national imperialism may be observed in the case of the German city of Danzig, desired by Poland for economic and strategic reasons, but established by the Peace Conference as a free city under the administrative supervision of a commissioner appointed by the League of Nations, there was beginning to appear a significant conflict between international administration and national imperialism. After the Peace Conference, French imperialists sought to secure, by indirect means, more than the conference had granted, particularly as regards the Saar, the left bank, and the Ruhr. In the internationalised Saar Basin, a French army of occupation was retained, French currency introduced, French schools established, French martial law declared. Indeed, the measures taken by French military authorities in the Saar territory were of such a nature that they were seriously challenged by Lord Robert Cecil and by Hjalmar Branting in the Council of the League of Nations. Ugly rumours were heard to the effect that French authorities were determined to prevent the inhabitants from voting for reincorporation in Germany in 1935. The fact that they are not heard now is an indication of the extent to which the situation has changed for the better in the last 2 years. More ambitious French aims were disclosed by the Dariac report, a secret memorandum alleged to have been drawn up by the President of the Finance Commission of the Chamber of Deputies and published by the Manchester Guardian. In this interesting document, the virtual separation of the Rhineland from Germany was urged on economic and strategic grounds. Another interesting document, cited by ex-Premier Nitti of Italy, was the alleged secret report, dated May 25, 1922, of a French military commission which recommended not only the permanent military control of the Saar Basin, inclusion of the left bank in the French customs frontier, and prolonged occupation of the Rhine, but boldly pointed out the economic desirability of controlling the Ruhr Basin. These secret documents coincided to a marked degree with the tenor of French policy in postbellum years, and with the public declarations of influential French industrialists and politicians. Poincaré's premier repeatedly announced that French troops would remain on the Rhine until Germany paid her reparations debt, which at that time seemed impossible. The Cologne bridgehead on the Rhine should normally have been evacuated in January 1925, had Germany been fulfilling the treaty terms. But French sentiment was strongly against even this partial relinquishment of the Rhine, and the decision was made by the Allies to continue the occupation until 1926. Attempts made by German separatists to set up a separate government in the Rhineland independent of Prussia were quite certainly favoured, if not actually inspired, by French officials, though they may not have been instigated by the French government itself. These manoeuvres to detach the Rhineland from Prussia and to make it a buffer state dominated by France failed of fruition. They were significant as indicating a policy or desire, rather than for their results. The boldest step toward French domination of Western Germany was the seizure of the Ruhr Basin by French and Belgian troops in January 1923. This district on the right bank of the Rhine was the very heart of the German iron and steel industries, and the most valuable coal mining area possessed by Germany. Its seizure was justified by the French government as a method of securing reparation from Germany, yet the deed could well be interpreted in line with the secret memoranda which have just been cited, and such an interpretation could find some support in the fact that French industrial magnates, such as Loucheur, were proposing that a portion of the stock of German industrial concerns in the Ruhr should be turned over to France. Such a plan, if it had been carried out, would have given France a permanent economic grip on the Ruhr. That would have been economic imperialism, not of the sort generally displayed in Asia and Africa, but of a new type, better suited to Europe. But as a result of the adoption of the Dawes Plan, France evacuated the Ruhr without obtaining the desired interest in the Ruhr industries. Instead, the Allies collectively obtained a mortgage on German railways and German industries as a whole. Again, national imperialism was checked by internationalism, and the evacuation of the Ruhr was followed by the Locarno Conference. French policy in Eastern Europe during the postbellum period was also tinged with imperialism. economic and military imperialism of a subtle form. By lending money to the members of the Little Entente, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia and Romania, by providing military experts to train their armies and by giving diplomatic support to their aspirations, and by making formal alliance with the chief of them, Czechoslovakia, the French government made these countries her protégés, her satellites. Such a relationship is legally quite different from a protectorate, which involves a partial transfer of sovereignty. Nevertheless, its practical results in securing strategic and economic advantages and in establishing a real though informal guidance over the policies of the protégés were different in degree rather than in kind from the fruits of imperialist protectorates. A more striking instance of this rarefied imperialism may be found in French relations with Poland. Poland was naturally inclined toward France, since the latter had been the most generous champion of extreme Polish territorial aspirations at the peace conference and afterward. Moreover, as against the potential enmity of Russia or Germany, France would be Poland's most natural ally. Indeed, when a Red Army from Russia swept into Poland, menacing Warsaw in 1920, it was France from whom the Poles obtained military supplies and military experts, and with the help of French officers Poland repelled the Bolshevists, extended her frontier to the east, and won peace with victory by the Treaty of Riga, October 12, 1920. This informal French patronage of Polish interests developed into a formal alliance. In February 1921 there was signed a Franco-Polish alliance treaty, by which the two nations agreed to act in concert, in case either should be attacked without provocation, and by which both agreed to cooperate in diplomatic and economic affairs. The cooperation may perhaps be described as somewhat one-sided. France made herself the resolute spokesman of the Polish claims in Upper Silesia, with the result that Poland secured a very favourable settlement in the partition of Upper Silesia in October 1921. It should be noted that what Poland obtained in this settlement was a rather larger share of the mining districts of Upper Silesia than strict conformity to the principle of self-determination might have allowed, and further, that in the mines that passed under Polish sovereignty, French financial interests secured a considerable measure of control. French economic imperialism, to be candid, operated through the medium of Polish nationalism. The iron hand wore a Polish glove, but the hand was there. Moreover, France lent Poland 400 million francs to be used in purchasing military and other supplies in France, and in reorganizing the Polish army and railways. Thus Poland was more closely bound to her patron by finance and military considerations, and a Franco-Polish commercial convention signed on February 6, 1922, arranged for reciprocal tariff reductions favouring the importation of French goods into Poland and vice versa. Not the old imperialism of annexation and protectorates, but a new imperialism of financial, economic and military patronage may be seen in this Franco-Polish alliance. Less open, less brutal, less monopolistic, less secure than conquest. The new imperialism was possible where conquest would have been quite inadmissible, and it was productive of many of the advantages obtained elsewhere by conquest. It gave France a real, though unacknowledged and insecure, influence over Polish foreign relations and Polish armaments, and it secured for French capital and French exports special favours in Poland. Subsection: Concessionaire Imperialism and Soviet Russia. By all odds, the most striking instances of the newer imperialism in postbellum Europe were those which concerned Soviet Russia. Before the war, Russia had been a field for French, Belgian, German and British investments, and the Tsar's government had borrowed heavily from France and England. But financial dependence had entailed neither the political subservience nor the granting of wholesale concessions for privileged economic exploitation. War and revolution opened the door to genuine imperialism. The war, cutting off imports of machinery and exports of grain, caused economic exhaustion, even retrogression in Russia. This was followed by the revolution, which in turn led to political instability and further economic exhaustion, aggravated by the Allied blockade and by communist experimentation with the economic system. While Russia was in this condition, French support was given to the counter-revolutionists, much as American support has been given on occasion to filibusters in Latin America. But the counter-revolutions were suppressed, and other tactics were needed. From 1921 on, Western European and American financial interests sought to obtain their ends in Russia through the familiar mechanism of concessions. The scramble for concessions in Russia, beginning in 1921, may fairly enough be regarded as imperialism. In aim, it was unquestionably similar to the quest of concessions in China or Turkey or Morocco. In method, however, it differed slightly, because Soviet Russia could not easily be bullied or coerced by punitive expeditions or assigned as a sphere of interest. Concession hunters had to rely principally on Russia's crying need for foreign capital, and on such diplomatic pressure as their governments might be induced to exert, though diplomatic pressure was not very effective at Moscow. Russia did need foreign capital, however. In 1921, the Soviet government decided upon what was called the New Economic Policy, a provisional compromise between communism and capitalism. One feature of the new policy was a willingness to offer industrial concessions to foreign capitalists in order to stimulate production in Russia and thus to create conditions, so the Bolshevists argued, in which communism might ultimately be successful. At the Hague Conference of 1922, the Russian delegates handed the Allied experts a memorandum stating that the Soviet government was willing to offer concessions to be exploited by mixed-stock companies in which foreign capital and the Soviet government itself would share. There followed an elaborate list of industries in which concessions might be granted. List ends at about 28 minutes and 33 seconds. Petroleum industry. Regions already exploited. A. Baku region. B. Grozny region. C. Ural-Emba region. D. Kuban region. E. Turkestan. 2. Regions prospected, but not yet exploited. Regions of Grozny. 3. Unprospected regions and areas. A. Baku region. B. Ural-Emba region. C. Kuban region. D. Turkestan. E. Province of Vologda. Mining industry. A. Iron ore. B. Copper. C. Polymetallic ores. D. Coal. E. Gold and platinum. Exploitations of forests. A. 33 regions in European Russia. B. Caucasus. C. Siberia. Paper manufacture. New enterprises. A. In the region of the Kem River. B. In the Kotlas region. C. Archangel region. D. Region of the Luga. E. Kuban. Sugar industry, match industry, manufacture of azotized products, chemical industry, electrotechnical industry, agricultural concessions. 1. Colonization concessions. 2. Improvement concessions. 3. Cultivation of cereals. 4. Concessions for stock raising. 5. Concessions for the construction of refrigerating establishments and elevators. 6. Concessions for harvesting and utilizing medicinal herbs. End of list. Such concessions usually gave the concessionaire monopolistic rights of exploitation over a specified natural resource in a specified district for a definite term of years, at the end of which the government would have the right to repurchase at cost. A number of concessions were soon negotiated. Krupp of Germany and Sinclair of America, for instance, obtained concessions for agricultural development in the Don region. An English syndicate secured a concession to exploit a forest area of more than 200,000 desiatines in the province formerly known as Vologda, now Komi, and others were reported or rumoured. The most interesting were the oil concessions. Russia's petroleum resources, variously estimated at from 8 to 15% of the world's total reserve, inspired keen desire and keener rivalry. Before the Great War, foreign and Russian capitalists had built up flourishing oil industries in the Baku and Grozny districts. These, however, had been nationalized by the Soviet government and assigned to an official trust or governmental monopoly for exploitation before the new economic policy was adopted. Such was the state of affairs when, in April 1920, France and England, represented by Premiers Mitterrand and Lloyd George, signed the celebrated San Remo oil agreement, providing for Anglo-French cooperation in seeking and exploiting oil resources in the Near East, in Romania, in Galicia, and what concerns us chiefly here, in Russia. After the adoption of the new policy by Russia, however, ambitious oil magnates endeavoured to forget the San Remo Pledge of Cooperation and Equal Participation. Indeed, in the spring of 1922, Krasin threw a veritable bombshell into the Genoa Economic Conference by disclosing the fact that the Royal Dutch Shell Combine had been negotiating with the Moscow government for a monopoly of the export of petroleum from Russia. The Royal Dutch Shell, one should explain, was the powerful Anglo-Dutch syndicate headed by Sir Henry Dieterding. Wild rumours echoed through the press of further concessions to be obtained by the British. Indignantly, French and Belgian oil interests vociferated against the grant to the British of oil properties they, French and Belgian capitalists, had owned in pre-war Russia and had lost by Bolshevist nationalisation. So strenuous were the Franco-Belgian protests, it was reported, that Royal Dutch Shell's negotiations fell through, and Dieterding agreed to abide by the policy of cooperation with the French and Belgians in seeking the restoration of their former oil properties and the acquisition of new fields in Russia. Thereupon, the current of petroleum intrigue found less public, subterranean channels, and only an occasional report or rumour leaked into the press regarding the progress of the bidding for Russian oil fields. A visit of Mr. Dodge representing the Standard Oil to Moscow was reported to have failed. A little later, the Sinclair Company was reported to have obtained a concession for large undeveloped oil fields in the Caucasus, Baku region, on condition of floating a loan of $250 million for Russia. Later, however, it was stated that this project, like so many others, had fallen to the ground. An important concession was obtained in 1924 by the W.A. Harriman Company of New York in 1924 for a monopoly of the export of manganese, which is used in the manufacture of steel, from the rich deposits of Georgia, one of the states federated with Soviet Russia. Another interesting grant for exploitation of the Lena goldfields was secured by a British concessionaire in 1925, but American capitalists enjoyed a half interest in the enterprise. Subsection: American Finance and European Independence. The prominence of American concession hunters in the Russian field was but one aspect of the startling development of the United States as the foremost contestant in the game of world finance. The Great War had transformed the United States, as has been said many times, from a debtor into a creditor nation. The close of the war found the governments of Europe indebted to the United States government for war loans and for sundry supplies to the amount of over $10 billion. Despite this huge extension of government credit to Europe, the tide of trade was flowing so strongly toward the United States, and Europe was so direly in need of funds for industrial as well as public purposes, that American bankers continued to make loans, and American investors continued to buy bonds at a rate unparalleled in history. It was estimated that $1 billion worth of foreign securities, chiefly European, were being purchased in the United States each year in the post-war period. In 1925, estimates published by the Department of Commerce indicated that private American investors had purchased $1,665 million in European government bonds or government-guaranteed securities, besides putting $450 million into industrial securities and direct investments. During the year 1925, American purchases of European securities amounted to about $610 million, and of other foreign securities, about $660 million. J.P. Morgan and Company rescued the declining franc by lending $100 million to France, and the same firm headed a syndicate which placed in the United States half of the international loan extended to Germany in accordance with the Dawes Plan in 1924. That Europe's need and America's affluence gave American financiers no small power in European affairs became increasingly obvious, for American bankers could grant or withhold loans. It was this consideration that gave Mr. Thomas Lamont such decisive though unofficial authority in the London negotiations regarding the Dawes Plan in 1924, and led some observers to believe that Wall Street held in its hand the destinies of the old world. European observers, too, were aware of, and prone to exaggerate, America's overshadowing economic power. The fear that had once led the German emperor to talk of the American peril along with the Yellow Peril, the nightmare vision of Baron Sonnino, that astute Italian foreign minister who feared the United States would establish a Pax Americana in quarrelsome Europe, the apprehension expressed in his memoirs by Count Sergei Witte, the famous Russian statesman, that the United States would enthrone itself on the debris of Europe. These and similar fears were revived and intensified in post-war Europe. Not much was said openly, except by an occasional daring historian or publicist, who might allude to the gigantic appetites or the Ausbreitungspolitik of America. Rarely expressed publicly, the apprehension was not less strong that American finance, backed by unrivaled natural resources and immense manpower, had now begun in Europe a peaceful penetration, to be followed by imperialist domination, subtle perhaps, and unavowed, but real. These European fears are natural enough, but, like the nightmares they are, chimerical. Like all nightmares, they leave certain realities out of consideration. One of these realities is that though American finance in post-war years gained great influence in the world, it by no means enjoyed an irresistible power to dominate either its own government or European nations. It could make terms before extending loans, but it could not play the master as England had done in Egypt, or France in Morocco and Tunis, or Japan in Korea. Another reality is European civilization. European nations are too highly industrialized and too highly conscious of nationality to be easily or permanently dominated by a nation of kindred civilization. In a period of political instability, such as prevailed in Eastern Europe after the war, or in times of extreme economic depression, imperialism of a sort is possible at the expense of European states, in proportion to their weakness and instability. But such imperialism, at least as affecting the larger nations, can hardly be more than a very subtle and rarefied imperialism, nor, when financial and political stability are regained, can it long endure. Of greater significance in the long view of events is the striking development of internationalism as a substitute for certain functions of imperialism. The Free City of Danzig and the Saar Basin, both under the control of the League of Nations, were interesting though small-scale experiments in this direction. More important were the experiments in international financial control. First Austria, bankrupt, despairing, and impotent, was taken in hand by the League of Nations and placed under a financial control which stabilized the currency and somewhat revived business confidence, though it did not produce as marked an economic stimulus as might have been desired. Next Hungary, likewise bankrupt and impotent, instead of falling victim to some imperialist great power, accepted a financial commissioner named by the League of Nations, and rapidly climbed the hard path back to solvency. Then, in 1924, the recommendation of the Dawes Committee of Experts, the Allies agreed with Germany for the imposition of a somewhat different form of international financial control upon Germany, for the purpose of replacing the worthless paper mark by a stable currency and securing regular payment of reparations without destroying German economic life. The granting of a mortgage on the German railways and a mortgage on German industries to the Allies, the assignment of certain German taxes to the commission appointed by the Allies, the provision for arbitration of disputes, these were highly interesting features, suggestive of the methods whereby recalcitrant or insolvent debtor states could be brought to book without employing such means as England used in Egypt or the United States in Haiti and Santo Domingo. Perhaps such international politico-financial control may be called imperialism, if there be any satisfaction in using the term, but that between the British occupation of Egypt, or the American occupation of Haiti, or the French conquest of Morocco on the one hand, and the international supervision of German, Hungarian, or Austrian finances, there exists a wide gulf of difference few unimpassioned students of world affairs are likely to deny. End of Section 1.